When you hear the words state collapse, you probably think of politics, right? Of conflict and civil war. But what about the money? What if the real story starts with the economy? Today, we're digging into the economic spiral of Somalia, all the way from its independence in 1960 up to the collapse in the early 90s. We're going to see how 3 decades of economic decisions basically set the stage for the whole thing to come crashing down. So, how does an entire nation's economy just fall apart? I mean, it's rarely one single event. It's much more like a line of dominoes. One problem tips over and knocks into the next, and then the next. To really get what happened in Somalia, we have to trace that chain all the way back to the very first link. Okay, let's start with just one single, staggering number. By 1984, Somalia was importing 6.5 times more than it was exporting. Just think about that for a second. It's like your own household spending 6.5 times its annual income. How long do you think you could keep that up? Yeah, it is a complete recipe for collapse. And that absolutely shocking number from 1984, that wasn't just a fluke. It was a massive, blinking red light, a symptom of a much deeper problem that had been festering since the country was even founded, this persistent, nagging trade gap. From the very beginning, Somalia was simply spending way more than it was earning. Now, economists have a name for this. They call it a trade deficit. But honestly, the easiest way to wrap your head around it is to think about your own budget. If you're constantly spending more than your paycheck, you have to cover that difference somehow, right? You're either burning through your savings or you're racking up debt. A country is really no different, just on a much, much bigger scale. And when you look at what was actually being treated, the problem becomes crystal clear. On one side, you have what Somalia was selling to the world: livestock, bananas, animal hides. Pretty much low-value raw materials. But on the other side, look at what it was buying: expensive, high-value goods like machinery, fuel, and electronics. It was a fundamentally lopsided deal from the start, one that almost guaranteed a permanent deficit. So, with the economy already on pretty shaky ground, the country suddenly takes a radical turn. After a military coup in 1969, the new leader, Siad Barre, rolls out this ambitious new plan: scientific socialism. The whole idea was for the state to take total control of the economy and basically force a path to self-sufficiency. So, here's the quick play-by-play. The coup hits in '69, and by 1970, the socialist plan is in full swing. And for the first few years, it actually looked like it might be working. New schools, hospitals, and roads were popping up. But then, 1977, the Ogaden War against Ethiopia breaks out. It was an incredibly expensive war, and it just started to bleed the country's resources dry, putting that whole experiment in serious jeopardy. And this is where you see this giant canyon between the promises and the reality. The government's big slogan was achieve food self-sufficiency. But their policies? They did the exact opposite. By forcing farmers to sell their crops to the state at rock-bottom prices, they basically killed any incentive for farmers to produce more. The result was an absolute disaster. By the late 80s, Somalia was one of the most food import-dependent nations in all of Africa. So, just as these internal policies were failing, the already fragile economy got hit by a series of devastating blows, from both inside and outside the country. These were shocks that the system was just not built to withstand. It was just a brutal, perfect storm. First, a catastrophic drought wiped out a massive chunk of the nation's livestock, which, remember, was the core of their export economy. Then the war, which not only burned through money, but also led to a messy breakup with their main superpower backer, the Soviet Union. And then, in 1983, came the final crushing economic blow. This was the killer. Almost all of Somalia's main export, livestock, was sold to one single country, Saudi Arabia. So when the Saudis suddenly banned all imports in 1983, it was like someone just walked over and turned off the main tap for the entire economy, overnight. And the impact was immediate, and it was devastating. Total export earnings just fell off a cliff, dropping by 44% in just 1 year. This wasn't a dip, it was an absolute freefall. The country's primary way of earning foreign currency had been pretty much wiped out. Okay, so you have to be asking, with a broken trade balance, failed policies, and a completely shattered export market, how did the state even keep functioning? Well, the answer is a familiar one in many parts of the world: a lifeline of foreign aid. Right, so after breaking with the Soviets, Somalia cozied up to the West and oil-rich Arab countries. And just like that, the money started pouring in. The amount of grant aid, we're talking free money, not loans, more than tripled in just 6 years. This aid became the absolute lifeblood of the state, paying for all those imports and basically keeping the government afloat. So with all that money flooding in, what did it actually accomplish? The answer is pretty stunning. Almost nothing. As this one researcher put it, the aid had a negligible positive impact. It was basically a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. It kept the system alive, but it did absolutely nothing to actually heal it. In fact, the situation was even worse than just being ineffective. Rampant corruption meant that huge amounts of this aid were just stolen or totally wasted. The country actually became known around the world as the graveyard of foreign aid, a place where international money just went to die. So let's just pull all these threads together. You've got a massive trade deficit, you've got failed economic policies, you have devastating external shocks, and it's all propped up by a reliance on aid that just papered over the cracks. By the 1980s, all these factors were swirling together, and the entire system just began to completely unravel. And here's the endgame. To cover all of its bills, the country just kept borrowing and borrowing. In 1970, foreign debt was a manageable 24% of the economy. But by 1989, it had skyrocketed to a staggering 189%. Somalia owed the world nearly twice what its entire economy could produce in a whole year. The situation was completely and totally unsustainable. The legacy of that whole socialist experiment was, well, pretty grim. Instead of creating a self-reliant powerhouse, the state's policies just backfired spectacularly. As the economist Jamil Mubarak wrote, they undermined industries, created scarcities, and gave rise to black market activities. Basically, people were forced to find ways to survive completely outside of the broken official system. So what does this whole story leave us with? Somalia's economy had these deep structural flaws from the very beginning, and then it got hammered by one crisis after another. And yet, for years, it was kept on life support by foreign aid. It really forces us to ask a tough question. When foreign aid is just masking a broken system instead of fixing it, does it just delay the inevitable? Is a final collapse not just likely, but guaranteed?